Welcome back. Moving on now from the Archaic Age down to the Classical Age. And this is directly after the Persian Wars. By this time, the Athenians had been under a democratic government now for almost 30 years. However, they didn't get themselves really established as a superpower in the ancient Greek world until the Persian Wars, to be discussed in a later video, in which they rose to political prominence because of not only their own military success against the Persians, but also their capacity to lead a Greek united front against further Persian intervention from the east. The Spartans had attempted to do that and had failed. And so the Athenians stepped forward. They took the matters in hand and were able to set up a whole network of allies that would combine in order to pressure the Persians to take themselves further away from the Greek world, to provide a buffer zone so that the Persians would be much less likely to bother the Greeks in the future. They were successful in this respect, but they unfortunately pushed it too far. This network of allies I just referred to is known in modern scholars as the Delian League, and that refers to the island of Delos, which you can find on your map. It's right directly in the middle of the Aegean Sea, and ironically, that black dot that you see next to the word Delos on your yellow and blue map is actually completely covering up the island itself. It's very, very tiny. It's about the size of the city's Central Falls in Rhode Island, about a mile square. So it's a really tiny island. But this island has enormous religious significance and mythological significance because, according to Greek myth, it is where the gods Apollo and Artemis were born. We have that described in a Homeric hymn, the first of two referring to Apollo, Delian Apollo. So the island of Delos is where money was kept that the allies were contributing into the Athenian League for the Athenians to be able to maintain their ships. It was their navy that was really the source of their power, which allowed them to patrol around the Aegean Sea, watching out for any trouble with the Persians. Also, of course, to keep the allies themselves under control, to travel further east to conduct campaigns as necessary, and in general to be able to keep up their commerce with trade and the ability to travel over to other cities in case there were any difficulties or any other type of maintenance supervision that might be necessary. So this league rose to great power, and it was a politician Pericles in Athens who recognized the possibility of imperialism in Athens and decided to take that league a step further, even after the Persian threat really receded, and the Persians did not appear any further to be interested in attempting to conquer the Greek world. Pericles was not willing to give up all the power that the Athenians had built up in that period, and so he ended up converting the city of Athens into the center of a major empire. It's somewhat of a precursor of the much larger Greek empire that Alexander ended up establishing, and then of course the very well-known empire that the Romans set up. So that effort in imperialism definitely profited the Athenians short term in the sense of being able to grow their city politically, a great deal more wealth. They are able to establish all of these alliances, and with this, they are able to further their success with literature and art and music and philosophy and many other arts. The difficulty, however, is that the Athenians pressed it too far, ended up eventually angering enough of the other Greeks around them, especially the cities that were hostile to them, such as Thebes, Corinth, and Sparta, and sometimes Argos as well. And those cities eventually turned on the Athenians, and it was that effort to bring the Athenians down that eventually culminated in the major war, the Peloponnesian War. Now, comedy was gradually getting established through the 5th century BC, the 400s, but it really reaches its acme, as it turns out, ironically, during the Peloponnesian War period in the last quarter of the 5th century BC, the 420s and 10s and 400s BC. And that's with Aristophanes and other playwrights as well, contemporary to him, whose works we have now lost. So eventually the Athenians fell in the Peloponnesian War. However, although the Spartans now had control over Athens, the Spartans ended up, very similar to what happens with a fumble in football, the Spartans ended up flubbing. their newfound effort at imperialism, and they ended up making things even messier than the Athenians had. So whatever errors the Athenians made, the Spartans did worse. So in the 4th century BC, the 300s, the Athenians were able temporarily to rise back up into supremacy again with a new allied league. And initially, they promised not to make all the same mistakes they did with the first league. But human nature being what it is, they eventually started stepping up the effort, and it was unsuccessful. Eventually, the Athenians were actually defeated by a coalition of their allies and finally ended up receding. And unfortunately for all of the Greeks, they ended up getting into a lot of infighting, and they gradually lost the unity that really defined them pretty prominently in the 5th century BC, and that made them vulnerable to incursion from the Macedonians up north, specifically the father of Alexander, Philip of Macedon. He was eventually able to come in and defeat the whole bunch of them at 338 BC in Chaeronea. When that happened, the Greeks then fell under Macedonian control, and thereafter, Philip himself was assassinated, but his son Alexander rose to prominence and was able to conquer, of course, not only southern Greece, but also the whole sweep of the Persian world, established all the way out through what today is Saudi Arabia and Iran, Iraq, and finally eventually over towards India. So the classical period basically represents as I say, the acme of Athenian democracy, which slowly begins to fade off and finally pretty much fades out completely in 322 BC. The Athenians did at times manage to reestablish their democracy, but once they lost this capacity for allied control, they were never again able to really become powerful the way they had been before. With the death of Alexander the Great in 322 BC, we see the end of the classical period. We now see the polis set up, giving way to a much more international kind of arrangement, where now you have these large leagues established in different places. It was in fact politically a very chaotic period at times, and once again we have the same problem that there was no real establishment of any real central power, and so where the Macedonians had done it before, now the Romans were in position. So the classical period again establishes Athenian prominence. Aristophanes, of course, is the best known of the old comedy playwrights, and it's his writings that are going to define old comedy in about midway through this period, the latter quarter, I should say, of the 5th century BC. Okay, in our next video, we're going to switch to our final age, which is Hellenistic, and we'll talk a bit about the Greek playwright Menander. Okay, we'll see you next video.